Hey, produce friends, Randy Hartman at Pacific Pro here. One of the primary questions that we receive as a Washington apple shipper and marketer is about the grading of the apples. How do you know what the grade is? What does a grade represent? What's the difference between a Washington Extra Fancy and a Fancy? And so, in this quick video, it may not be that quick, probably around 8 to 10 minutes, depending on how wordy I get. But I'm going to try to dispel some of the ambiguity regarding grades, and that creates a lot of confusion. And this is a rule of thumb. It is something that everybody has questions about, and it's not super well defined necessarily. Individual shippers and labels may have different grades depending on the variety. Varieties themselves have different standards to create the different grades. So what I'm going to do is dive into that right now and do my best just to kind of walk through at least our rule of thumb and what we try to use and operate by here at Pacific Pro. So to start, I'm going to repurpose a previous slide here. And this is a slide that shows what we're talking about when we're talking about grades. So if you look, for example, the Red Delicious up at the top, it's a little small. I apologize for that. The Red Delicious has down the left-hand column in this chart 4 different grades, but generally 5, 6 to 7 grades. They've got a Washington Extra Fancy Premium, and that's the premium line. That's the top grade. A Washington Extra Fancy number 1 is the second overall grade. A Washington Extra Fancy number 2, third overall grade. And then a grade we don't show here, but a number of shippers do put up or growers put up is a US Extra Fancy. And then after that, we have a Fancy, which is the lower grade. And that usually is what we use for school and a lot of food service. And the premium or the top grade is something you'll see used primarily by retailers because it's something that consumers are willing to pay a premium for. And then we have a US 1 grade, which is a lower grade, and that often is used for different processing, maybe for dipping, carameled apples, the like. So this is what we mean when we talk about grading, and you'll see it for different varieties. The next is a Gold Delicious. That generally only has 3 grades, although some shippers do 4 grades. Granny Smith, same thing, often 3 grades, but some shippers do 4 grades. And then the Gala is similar to the other red varietals like the Fuji, Honeycrisp, Ambrosia, Pink Ladies, etc. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about grading. So we'll go to the next slide here, and you will see what we mean when we talk about grades and the differences per variety. And let me blow this up, see if you can see it any larger. What we're looking at here, again, is a breakdown of the grades. So as you'll see on the left-hand side, you've got the different varieties on the top box here. And then across the second row on the top of the chart, you'll see the grades. So WashX Premium, WashX number 1, WashX number 2, US Extra Fancy, Fancy, and US number 1. And so I'll just go through these by variety to give you kind of an idea how to interpret it. And then we've got this as a stock document that we can send over if you have any interest in this or any of your team could benefit from this. Please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or somebody else in our office, and we will be happy to get that over to you. So as you'll see on the Red Delicious Premium, we show a minimum color. What makes it a premium is a minimum color of 95%. And that means the red apple is going to have 95% of the apple is going to be that deep, dark red. And in a Red Delicious, often that will mean that elongated shape, or what we refer to as like a Coke bottle shape that reds are known for, the iconic shape that Red Delicious are known for. And then defects less than 5%. And the defects less than 5%, some of that is based on what we look for pre-shipping, and that would be any sort of external scarring. Obviously, no decay or other breakdown is allowed in the apple pre-shipping, but defects would be any sort of something that may be less than perfect or ideal. And that's way less than what USDA allows for good arrival, which I believe is, off the top of my head, 15% makes good arrival for total overall defects. And then you go into a Washington Extra Fancy number 1, you're talking about 85% to 100% full color, but usually it's going to have less than the 95, obviously, to put it in a WashX. WashX number 2, minimum of 65% color, and US Extra Fancy 45, Fancy so half the apple would be red and the other would be the yellowish or whitish background. And then you'll see as we go through that, the defect, kind of what is allowed in that box goes up. And then so rule of thumb usually is if it's a Washington Extra Fancy, you're going to get a really clean apple with little to no defects externally, no scarring, limb rubs, all those kind of things. Definitely no decay that you won't have or shouldn't have very little of in any of the grades. But it's usually the external defects and the color that kind of determine what grade they go in. So in a Gold Delicious, most growers do three grades. You got a Washington Extra Fancy Premium, a Washington Extra Fancy number 1, and a U.S. Extra Fancy is the lowest grade, generally packed in a Gold Delicious. But some growers do a Washington Extra Fancy number 2. So in a Gold Delicious Premium, you're going to see a full yellow or green apple with very minimal to no defects. And then if you go into a Wash Extra Fancy number 1, you may get a little bit of blush in the apple. You may get a little bit of russeting coming out of the stem bowl, which you want to get in a premium, or very little of that. And then if you go into a U.S. Extra Fancy, you're going to have generally a little more skin defects. So you're going to see maybe some more scarring or limb rubs, various things like that. Granny Smith, very similar. A premium Granny Smith is also referred to as an all green, meaning there's no blush in the apple. Most of you have seen a Granny Smith that has blush in it. That's not unusual at all. It's kind of the way they grow and based on the weather and the temperatures during their growing season. But if it does have blush on it and it's 15% or less, that pushes it into a Washington Extra Fancy number 1 grade, which is generally it's going to be a mostly green apple with 15% blush. If it does have blush, it can't be generally qualified as a premium or all green. And then you go into a Wash X number 2. Not all shippers or growers put up a Wash X 2. Those that do, generally, you're going to have just more than 15% blush, which is what this chart shows. So anything with 30, 40, 50% blush in it, but still a really clean apple would go into this Washington Extra Fancy number 2 box. And then if you have any sort of external defects, it still could be all green or it could have blush in it. Either one of those could push it. Doesn't determine whether it's in a U.S. Extra Fancy. It's if it has any sort of defects on the apple that would put it into a USX. And again, they have to be relatively minimal defects. If it's any significant amount of defects, then that would put it into likely what's considered a U.S. number 1 grade, or significant defects that would put it into or a juice grade apple. So all these grades typically are for apples that go in full 40-pound cartons and will be eaten as a whole apple. They may be sliced or other things like that, but these are generally a good-looking apple that a consumer would want to take and eat. It doesn't have that many defects, so even a U.S. Extra Fancy is going to be relatively clean when compared to something that would go into a coal or into a slicer or a juicer. Then we go into what are, the big varieties now, the Galas, the Fujis, the Pink Lady, Honeycrisp, etc. There's a lot of those. And typically what we say is a premium in one of those red varieties is generally going to be about 60% plus full color, meaning it's not going to be the entire red, isn't going to be a Gala where it almost looks like a dark red delicious. That would obviously be really high color and put it in that premium. But you get down to about 60% full color, still being in a premium, again, the minimum defects. And then go into a Wash Extra Fancy 1, it's going to be about 20% less color. So 40%-ish or so, give or take, depending on the shipper and the grower. And then a Wash X number 2 is going to be what we call a tinge to that 40% minimum. And the tinge really is just a little bit of color. So anything over 0 really is what we consider a tinge, but it'd still be a clean apple and not have much defects so that it wouldn't be pushed into a U.S. Extra Fancy. So it'd still be, a clean exterior with minimal to no defects, limb rubs, scarring, any of that kind of stuff, but it would have really low color, and that makes it a Wash X2. And then if it has more defects, again, that'll put it into U.S. Extra Fancy. It could be a really high color premium or Wash Extra Fancy number 1 color, but have external defects, which would put it into a U.S. Extra Fancy grade. So that is hopefully makes a little bit of sense. there's other things that go into it. And obviously you want to have a certain amount of pressures, that it punches a certain amount of pressure. We concern ourselves with the sweetness and the bricks, or the amount of sugar in the apple as well. But this hopefully gives you a little bit of understanding of what we look at when we're talking about the different grades. And it could differ depending on who you talk to, but this is a general rule of thumb, at least to give you an idea maybe of what we mean when we talk about premium, Wash X1, Wash X2, US Extra Fancy, and Fancy. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, and I will have my email here listed after this, and or our team at sales@pacprosales.com. And if we can help with any other information, we'll keep rolling these videos out, hopefully to be a better support, better service to you and your team. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.